Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on caffeine and philosophy.
Okay, we should be live now. So, Kyle, have you heard about the election that cannot be challenged? The election whose integrity is unassailable.
Anytime that the press decides that whatever anybody else has to say, shut up about it. This is legitimate. Nobody else should talk about anything other than this, about how great he is. That is the first second that I suddenly, I don't trust anything out of the press. Mm-hmm. So yes, I have heard about the election. I still count it as fraudulent.
Yeah, well, you're in good company. I think Robert Barnes calls Joe Biden his fraudulence the second. And I forgot to check which president earned the honor of his fraudulence the first. It was someone remarkably unmemorable, like Grover.
I believe Cleveland. It's Grover Cleveland.
Yeah, yep. That sounds right. So yeah,
well, he was actually the one that was seen as the very first illegitimate president in the United States.
Yeah, which is kind of a bit of a white pill in a way, because like, what was the effect of Grover Cleveland on American history in general? I mean, as far as I can tell, pretty negligible. So, you know,
well, I believe Grover Cleveland is also the president who was elected. He lost his second election and won another one, wasn't he? Like, he had a split presidency.
I should be able to just like pull this stuff up. We're in the internet age. We can just
pull that up suddenly. Grover. Yeah, but with Biden, it's kind of a weird thing, because we have
he was elected twice.
So we have record low trust in media, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the media is the only people really screaming like everything is legitimate. Any kind of talk of a fraudulent election or an illegitimate presidency needs to be banned off the internet. Any kind of election interference is banned off the internet, or comes with severe labeling from Facebook, Twitter, and the like, stating that, you know, these are fact checked, the claims are disputed, and that inevitably led to President Trump being banned off of Twitter. So with such low trust in the media, the second that they say anything is the second I don't really trust it. And I don't like to be a conspiracy theorist or paranoid of that nature, but there is something about a permanent wall at the people's house that screams consent of the governed.
Yeah.
And it has a big flare gun that has the word not consenting of the governed. So that's my idea on the election that cannot be questioned.
There was this great speech given by an English queen in the 1600s. I forget who it was offhand, but the gist was that she said, there are advisors who say I shouldn't walk among you, and I'll work on pulling up the quote as I speak. But the gist is, here it is, Queen Elizabeth, and this was 1588. She said, "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that, under God, I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live or die amongst you all, to lay down my life for my God and my kingdom, and for my people, my honor, and my blood, even in the dust." A little different attitude.
Little bit. I don't see him talking with anyone. Like, I didn't see him. I don't see him talking with anybody. I didn't see him campaign hardly at all. When he did, there was like 5 people there. The amount of security for Joe Biden is absolutely ridiculous. And comparatively, when I saw Trump, again, I didn't vote for him. I've never voted for Trump, but it's kind of a stark difference between the two when you have so much security following around Joe Biden. But Trump would routinely go in front of, what is it, the Naval Academy, and shake thousands of people, hundreds to thousands of people's hands on a regular basis.
Or
Like, he had no fear
the,
of his people.
walk across the DMZ completely unaccompanied.
Yeah, and there's that kind of boldness. There's the, like, I'm sure there was a part of him that was probably terrified. Like, all they have to do is grab me right now and I'm screwed. But for some reason, Trump, regardless, he kind of showed that brave face of, I am amongst the people and I am one of the people, even though he's a billionaire. And I think that that's where we're starting to run down this claim of class difference, where some of the poorest Americans in the country were associating with one of the richest. And he spoke their language. And that, so I don't think this is I think this is, it used to be a class, but now I have to agree with them that it's now an elitism and an oligarchical long class. Because you look at like Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and they're kind of people of the million or billionaires of the people. Like, everybody loves Elon Musk. A lot of people really love Donald Trump. And yet you see people like Hillary Clinton, you see people like Joe Biden, you see people, a lot of them who are in this elitist class. They're not one of us, and we know it. Yeah, they don't come off as genuine. They're the least authentic human beings we've ever seen.
This is, I think, fundamentally why the bread tuber, like Gen Z communists are wrong, who think that it's all about class and it's just the wealthy versus the poor. It's like, no, there are wealthy people who are very much at war with each other based on institutional allegiance. And this is, the popular theory as to why the elites and the super wealthy hated Donald Trump so much is because he was a traitor to many of those powerful institutions. And the fact that he was able to speak to the public is sort of brings us into the whole free speech thing that we were talking about before. The fact that he was able to resonate people may or may not have to do with him having the best words, all the words, the most incredible words ever. But there is something to that, I think, because everyone approaches the subject of free speech first and foremost with the idea of freedom in mind. And there's an argument against free speech I wanted to bounce off you, and this might be entertaining for whoever might listen to this as well. But what if we approach the issue of whether or not free speech should be good or not, beginning with the nature of speech first, rather than the free part? Because it has seemed to me for quite some time that politicians have a proclivity to speak in vacuous platitudes frequently. And Trump is almost... he is such a culmination of that vacuity that it is almost self-parody, and I'm not even trying to criticize him when I say that. It's just an observation, and this doesn't really distinguish Trump from Biden or Clinton in any meaningful way. They all seem to do this because they all have to do this. And when you look at the nature of speech, we have words that are arbitrary as sounds associated with ideas. And the meaning associated with certain words can be rather nuanced. So if I say that a person was accused of something, that carries one set of baggage. But if I say it is alleged that this guy committed something, that carries a different set of baggage. And you can construct all sorts of sentences that are semantically identical but with different connotations, right? And that applies to pretty much every word besides basic articles like the and things like that. Even words like America don't have a universally positive connotation and can generate different visual images in people's minds as far as what America looks like and entails and so forth. And so when you're speaking to a large audience, there's actually no way to say the same thing to all of them, because for the speaker to communicate with any individual person, he has to have some mental connection with the person he's speaking to about like what sorts of words will have what sort of effect on this or that person. And so politicians are forced by sheer scale of audience to speak in vacuous platitudes that are the emotional connotation is more important than the actual semantic meaning. And so when you come back to free speech, the idea that we're protecting our ability as a society to have meaningful conversations about politics and science and what's right and wrong and religion and whatever other important things, it becomes kind of a noble but naive misunderstanding of the way that language works, and maybe the dangers of the miscommunications that are inevitably going to follow from people trying to communicate at such an impossible scale outweigh the potential benefits, which were never going to happen due to the nature of language itself.
Well, trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator is nothing new. We've always tried to do broad appeal because that's what we're trying to do. The problem is that we're such a large country. Most people who don't really realize that driving from California to Maine is equivalent to driving from Portugal to Moscow. So when you're dealing with something where the vast majority of countries, like a considerably large country like the United Kingdom, is roughly the size of Michigan. So when you're trying to appeal to that broad of people, it is really difficult, especially when we have such you have the difficulty of different cultures. Nobody can contest that New York culture is different than culture in Alabama. Same thing with California and Wisconsin. We definitely have different cultures in different regions of the United States. But with that, we are also in a time of transition where our preconceived notions of what our speech protections are in the United States are up in the air, because we now have the sudden proclivity for people to state openly that there should be hate speech laws, even though it flies in the face of decades and decades of Supreme Court rulings, as well as the most prominent Brandenburg versus Ohio. So when we're looking at protected speech versus protected versus unprotected speech, that has some pretty cut and dry kind of meanings. Like, what can the government enforce when it comes to speech? But when we have the ruling of the mob, which I keep hearing as, you do have free speech, you just don't have freedom from accountability, which is why the mob is doing this. The problem is this rapid changing of what is and is not punishable, and what the consequence should be. When we saw the Evergreen State College incident, a lot of people who were saying something, a very liberal professor, Brett Weinstein, he wasn't saying anything
for the
bad.
audience, because we were talking before about memory loss and short attention spans, and the Evergreen incident was several years back. So give us a quick refresher on what the Evergreen incident was.
So my original home state of Washington has a college down near Olympia. It's called Evergreen State University. Their grading system is very odd, to say the least. They basically have a pass-fail system on every single class.
Can we call it progressive?
It is a very progressive college. And it became so progressive that they wanted to ban firearms from the police who had to deal with the students, wherein it got so activist-led progressive, they ended up taking the principal hostage because they were in conflict over some of the rules on campus, saying that they were horribly racist and they were transphobic and all the like. And when a very liberal professor named Brett Weinstein said, listen, there is room for open discourse and you just can't shut down people you disagree with, that's anti-democratic, that's anti-liberal.
Very liberal. I thought he was a fascist.
No. He's voted Democrat, I think, forever. He's basically a blue dog Democrat, which means that if you put a blue dog on the ballot, they will vote for him. So he's a blue dog Democrat. He's always been a Democrat, but he really upset the mob, basically saying, no, you can't just beat people. You can't punch them. You can't assault people simply for disagreeing with you. And speech is not violence, which they inherently disagree with. So they ended up threatening him to such a degree that when he showed up on campus the very next day, the police had to kind of ambush him on the way in and said, listen, they are searching for you. You are not welcome at the campus right now for your own safety. So this is the kind of sudden, rapid change. It's not a matter of, if you want to shout down a whole bunch of morons claiming that, Jesus is the only way and the Bible needs to be taught in schools, or that, Allah is the only way and anybody who doesn't believe in him should be, murdered, or that gays aren't people, or that video game causes violence, any of these kind of ideas that are just kind of out there, even the white nationalism that I've always argued against, these ones are, pretty easy to go, well, that's silly, and you can shout them down more often than not pretty easily, and most people won't care. But it does fly in the face of traditional liberalism, is that we have become so intellectually lazy that we cannot even compete against very simplistic ideas such as white nationalism. But with this rapidly changing idea of what is and is not acceptable speech, holding that up as the pinnacle of what we should base our laws off of, and accountability of whether or not you are allowed to maintain your job, live in a certain town, go to certain stores, or even own a store and have customers who don't vandalize your store. That is something that I think we are in that transition, that if we were to prop up hate speech as a law fundamental that is actual punishable under the to the citizenry, we flawed ourselves as a country.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a danger in that, in the same way that there's a danger to all laws. I mean, I am pretty libertarian as far as what I think should be illegal, and I'm one of those guys who thinks that seatbelt laws are an outrage against the foundational principles of American justice. I think it's C.S. Lewis has this great quote about laws that try to protect you from yourself, treating you like a retard or a child or an animal, and there's no way to run any kind of republic on that kind of principle. I've
actually argued against that before.
Against the seatbelts or against the C.S. Lewis quote?
C.S. Lewis quote. I've actually argued against that very point.
Well, there are good arguments against it. Cass Sunstein would take issue with it, I'm sure, as well. But there's an artificial distinction that is made between speech and action that a lot of people who defend free speech have begun taking, and this is fairly recently. But sort of to return to my argument in the context of what you said here, you say that what has been permitted and what is censored has been changing so rapidly. How could that be? Because the laws seem to be pretty stable. What are the verbal mechanics that permit what is censored and what is permitted to change so quickly?
So it's 2 points. One is the mob rule that is associated with the hate speech that is being kind of festered up by the mob. If somebody who is prominent enough declares that somebody has done wrongthink, who has done hate speech, who has violated the norms of their new society, of their utopia, that is allowed to have violence committed against them in prevention of them committing violence against others. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, and the secondary portion is the lack of political will and enforceability of rule against the mob. So for many occasions, we've seen protests people like myself, when I was over at the University of Washington, when people have ambushed me or surrounded me, hitting me, kicking me, assaulting me, so on and so forth, They banned me from campus for 2 days for my own protection. So when you have something unjust happen to you and you are the one punished because the unenforceability of the law to those who have broken it, that is coming up to like this weird clash of titans kind of mentality of the law versus the mob rule. Where do we go?
Well,
who is going to win? And why should we take, why should we take what we're taking from the mob when, if they're not going to enforce the standard of law or the rule of law against the mob, but they know full well we will adhere to the same law that the mob refuses to listen to.
So if they're not enforcing the rule of law on, say, hate speech against the mob, for like, why can't someone sue them? Why are they not being accused of hate speech in a legal context? Because
that's
it seems very, very like obvious to me that they are the most hateful people in the room. And this is the classic Hitchens argument against hate speech is he's borrowing from Milton and others, but who's going to decide, right? There's a subjectivity in determining what is hateful and hateful towards what. And of course Hitchens took the seeds of my later position that sometimes hate's a good thing, actually. Sometimes hatred is moral and deserved and just. But that notwithstanding, we can't even seem as a society to be in agreement on what's hateful.
Well, that's actually an interesting thing that you brought up, is like why are they not protecting you when it's their job, correct?
Well, I'm saying, well, that's, I guess, a part of it. I'm more saying we can't even decide who the aggressor is in these contexts very often, because it's so subjective. Just as defining hatred in these contexts seems to be pretty subjective. That's always been the challenge.
So there's two. Now, I personally have a solution to this, but the biggest issue is that, one, when I say the unenforceability, it's because there's too many of them right now. That there's too many people who are willing to commit violence and break the law simultaneously for the police to be able to actually apprehend and charge wrongdoers. Not only when, again, here's another story from UW. I was assaulted on campus. It was a different one than being surrounded. And when the police directly saw her, they saw her assault me. They ended up basically detaining her. They had her in handcuffs. They literally had her, red-handed. And they were shouted down by the mob. I have a video of it where they just screamed as loud as they could. They surrounded the police until they literally had to let her go in fear for their own lives.
Right.
Now, and the reason for it is because they by law don't have to do anything for you.
Right.
I know it's their job. I know that we as a people understand that, police are there to protect us, but they don't legally have to do anything for you. And that's actually backed up in Castle Rock versus Gonzalez. That was actually a 2005 case. So, do they have to? No.
I imagine it's pretty demoralizing to the cops themselves when they get shouted down that way, because they know they're under a lot of, shall we say, moral linguistic pressure these days, thanks to a particular movement that's trying to describe them as bad, especially when they don't do what they're told by the mob. But but again, like the justice and the concept of justice is, as you say, so flexible. Vox Day describes the movement of social justice warriors in particular, but I feel increasingly like it describes society as a whole these days, like the movement of a school of fish that's always shifting and moving in unison, and woe to the fish who gets left behind and swims right when the rest of the school swims left. The school will turn around and eat that fish in a heartbeat. And it's all so subjective. And this is why was trying to pivot from hate speech in particular, where the subjectivity is sort of accepted everyone understands that the trouble with hate speech is how do you determine if a motive, how do you determine a state of mind from someone's words? It's more complicated than you'd think. Except that's how all of language works. That's how all of language works. And this is why we're getting these crazy cases where this has not happened yet, to my knowledge, but the equivalent of, Orwell's 1984 being banned for advocating totalitarianism happens. We see that with less metaphorical and more like an annually recurring ritual these days. Annual banning of Huckleberry Finn for being racist.
Or the British man who was arrested for hate speech while quoting Winston Churchill in public.
Yeah.
At Speaker's Square.
Yeah. Or the perhaps the most culturally famous instance was Count Dankula being arrested, the Scottish comedian, for teaching his girlfriend's pug to do a Sieg Heil Nazi joke. The Nazis being the butt of the joke, you would think, but because they're of the subjectivity of language and of comedy in particular, comedy is very tricky to hit the right note in the audience, and it's so contextual. People forget that the actual Nazis in the 30s arrested I believe it was a Finnish gentleman who taught his dog to do the Sieg Heil Nazi salute as well. The actual Nazis thought it was disrespectful. But the joke of it all, to inject some humor into it, is that the Nazis at least didn't prosecute him. They arrested him, but then they released him.
Yeah, they found him innocent. They said that he hadn't committed anything wrong under the law. That's
the UK government is literally worse than Nazis in this context, which is amazing.
So here's a point on free speech that I wanted to hit you with, and I've been in conflict with this for a while, and I've argued. I spend a lot of time on chat rooms and everything like that, but kind of throwing ideas out into the ether to see what comes back, see what sticks, see what's a terrible idea. Traditionally, that's how I develop a lot of my ideas. I normally go to the worst place in the world, the internet, and ask their opinion. So, but this is something that I've gotten pushback on, but I have never heard a legitimate argument against it.
Okay.
When it comes to the protection of free speech. We are arguing, and this is mainly my now combative argument against social justice warriors who are saying that it's a private platform and they can do what they want. Okay? You didn't want to bake a cake, and so now you get to live with the repercussions of, not allowing your president to speak on Twitter, right? So there's an element of this that I think we have lost. And when does a private entity become a government entity?
Like a utility, as they talk about with social media?
No.
Oh, actually government.
Yes. And what I mean by that, without a formalization of nationalization for that industry, when does it become government? And the reason I ask that, I will pull up two articles. Okay. One is from Politico by Nancy Scola and Alex Thompson, November 16th, 2020. Former Facebook leaders are now transitioning insiders into the Biden administration. Okay. They have listed as 3 people. Former Facebook members, Jeff Zients is now co-chairing Biden's transition team, as well as another board member to Facebook, and 2 others has joined, as well as a UK Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, who worked as a Facebook executive and is now into the Biden transition team, as well as another person named, where does he go? Jessica Hertz, who was a Facebook executive. So we always complain about the revolving door at Wall Street, right? And we know that game is rigged. We've seen this through the GameStonk issue, where basically pretty much the entire community on Robinhood and all the other forums were basically became the orcs, where they had the imagination of, I want this stock to go up, and they just cried WOG, and it went up. And
So great.
and
So
what
good.
did they do? They stopped almost every single platform across the board: Robinhood, TD Ameritrade, Equa. It's not Equifax. E-Trade and a couple others. They literally stopped people from buying that stock, meaning that it only had the ability to sell, ergo it only had the ability to go down.
Right.
So when you say that the game is rigged in Wall Street stock market, when Janet Yellen, our current, I believe, treasurer, was just paid $800 million by Citadel, the people who are literally bankrolling Robinhood, who blocked the trade. And now she's going to be overseeing this issue. That's a huge conflict of interest. You got paid almost $1 million to do this. And so we continuously criticize that revolving door of Wall Street insiders going into the administration. Almost every single person across the board, left, right, and indifferent, it is, look, it's the same thing. Meryl Streep, or Merrill Lynch, not Meryl Streep, Merrill Lynch, and all the other people who have always come and gone inside and out of Wall Street or the administration, they're back. What a surprise. But we're not talking about how often social media giant executives are going into the administrations of either the Obama team, the Trump team, or the Biden team. And when so many people are going from Facebook, Twitter, and others directly into the government, and then right back out of the government into Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and all the others, when does this become an entity of government? When government administrators are literally just taking a hiatus from government authority to go police you on social media and then go right back into the government.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's especially relevant when so many representatives and senators and the president, as it may be, and even the Pope apparently use Twitter as an official medium of communication with the public. I have very mixed feelings about the whole, private versus public situation. But again, this goes back to maybe the problem is with believing in free speech in the first place, because it's only a paradox if you have that expectation. And the reality is, even if you are free from legal consequences, if you take the most extreme form of free speech, which the sort of absolutist position, that doesn't prevent you from suffering the negative social and associative consequences from what you say at a general level. And I'm not trying to defend the people who say, free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences, because they're talking about basically organized hate mobs that go around and try to unperson you and get you to lose your job and so forth. But I mean, some of the worst consequences of speech I've suffered, I don't think I've ever suffered any legal consequences for speech, but I have suffered some personal consequences, especially in my family and friend group. And there have been circles I've gone into motivated purely by a desire to defend free speech, by defending the most attacked people in the world. And of course, I didn't understand how language worked back then. I was thinking in terms of arguments and grammar, and this sentence means X because of the order of the words and so forth. And if someone just hears, "Oh, you said that," it's like, no, you didn't understand the sentence. But that's sort of naive, and it goes back to communication is not a one-person activity. It's not one person says something and another person either gets it or doesn't get it. I could say a sentence, for example, we have no evidence that David Cameron ever fucked a pig head. I could say that sentence, and people could interpret that as, oh, well, then it didn't happen, or they could interpret that as, oh, that definitely must have happened, because why so specific? And we as the speakers aren't necessarily in control of what associations people draw from that. And the left has discovered that. And they've decided to use this subjective interpretation in the most gaslighting, manipulative, and malicious fashion imaginable. I think everyone's favorite example was the failed attempt by Kathy Newman on Jordan Peterson on Channel 4, which is so worth watching. But it really gets to the heart of the problem with language that we're dealing with here. And so when it comes to are these platforms, aspects of government? Well, I mean, I'm not sure that the government is required to offer a platform to people. Are they? I mean, they're ostensibly required to protect our right to say what we want. But if these institutions are anything like private entities, surely they have a right not to associate their brand with certain speech on the platform. Now, the problem is the false advertising. Jack Dorsey says, we're the free speech wing of the free speech party. No, you're not, Jack. You're the lying part of the what do they call it now? The spying capitalism. There's a new term for what Silicon Valley does. They just spy on everyone, and you're the lying wing of the spying industry. It's not quite CIA level bad, but you get in there.
So the only issue that I rise with that is it's very pointed. Okay, it's only affecting a small subsection of people, and that is those who are outspoken and not on the rather left-wing side of the spectrum. And a lot of people will say that, well, no, they go after their own. Like, we kind of love it when they eat their own, right?
Right.
Okay. The problem is that they've outused their usefulness. Okay. And normally it's the people who are, it's going after a prize. You want them to be destroyed. Why? Because you don't share what they're doing, you don't care about what they're doing, and they don't agree with you. In which case, they can be thrown to the lions without affecting those specific people. But there are other people who put out content on a regular basis that would traditionally violate the social accepted norms or the correct mindset of the liberal left or the social justice warriors or the progressive left, whichever one you want to call them. And I bring up one noted as Seth MacFarlane. Seth MacFarlane produces Family Guy. He's produced a number of others, which is probably one of the most homophobic, disability phobic, or they make fun of everyone, right? They make fun of everyone across the board. Okay, but they're fine. Why? And it's because Seth MacFarlane has been so vocally anti-Trump, pro-liberal, so on and so forth, that there is, and he provides content to people who enjoy it. People still like to see his movies. They listen to his albums and they watch his shows. So of course they don't want to destroy him because they get something out of him.
Right.
And for now, he aligns with their political ideology. So it doesn't necessarily just mean that when people bring forward to me the idea, well, this isn't freedom from consequence, well, that would be fine if you did it the same to everybody regardless of what they made or political persuasion. But you don't.
Why should they punish their own side? I mean, like, I know why I would like them to punish their own side, but, like, why should they take advice from me? Because they don't like me or agree with me. What is the case to be made saying, well, you need to punish your side just as well? We need to have some shared vested interest in an institution like the government, ostensibly, which gives better results for everyone and which permits, healthy debate and disagreement and even conflict to a certain degree within certain constraints. But what we have when we classify speech in general as something other than an action. speech is not action in the way that like attacking someone is. I could go up to a stranger in the street and I could punch them in the face, and I would likely get sued for assault, and I would get fined, maybe spend some time in jail. Who knows? I could spit on their shoe and get much of that as well. But if I create a blog that documents their life history and all of the negative associations they've had, all the handshakes they've made with bad people, I have done infinitely more damage to their life than if I had just punched them in the face. I have possibly wrecked their career. I could come up with all sorts of horrible, libelous things to say, and I could do it in a way, anyone who actually understands how language works knows how to do this without actually committing libel. The fun example I listen to frequently is Scott Adams. You listen to him talk about how there's no evidence of fraud in this last election, and he'll say that repeatedly in a way that leaves the viewer with the absolute certainty that fraud was just kind of a given. Like, who doubts that there was fraud? But he never said that there was fraud. He said the opposite. He said there's no evidence that the courts have seen or passed verdict on about fraud. There is no court-approved evidence of fraud. And the effect is obvious. And at the end of the day, language is an action. Our words do have effects in much the way that actions can directly have effects as well. They just use other people as implements. Just as I might use a stick to beat someone instead of my fist. I'm using an implement. Well, I can use other people that way as well. And the problem with laws against that try to prohibit that kind of speech is, well, how do you tell that they're doing that? How can you tell that they're inciting violence, for example? You can't, because it's subjective, and the interpretation makes legally defining that difficult, which is why I think laws against hate speech are so bad. But maybe that's a problem with free speech generally as well. Maybe the correct approach and understanding is free speech is terrible, and for that reason, censorship is even worse.
I don't disagree. There is certain constraints to speech that we have found to be of worth. Everybody knows the whole don't say fire in a crowded theater thing.
Which is the worst example. Libel is the strongest example.
I know. Yeah. Yes. Now, the problem that I keep running into this is I find that we have a solution, but no political will or intellectually, understanding leaders who would actually be able to implement this. Is a very simple one. Is one, switch the libel laws, literally turn them on their head. Which is, if somebody were to lie about you and you want to sue them, feel free. But that means that if you sue someone, you have to they have to prove that it's true. You can't prove that it's false. Like, it's really hard to prove a negative. In which case, if we were to flip it, it's very similar to the United Kingdom's rule of speech on libel laws, is if somebody lies about you, you are free to sue them. And they now must prove what they said is true. But if they do prove that it's true, you have to pay every single court fee, as well as all the lawyer fees for everything. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is a punishment for doing it. On the other hand, we over here, where I have to prove that it's false, that's almost impossible. And especially for people, unless you are as lucky as the Covington kid, where you're literally just a nobody who gets thrust into the national spotlight, it's unlikely to happen, and the damage will be permanent.
Well, what if I'm a comedian and I'm talking about the Covington kid, and I don't make any allegation explicitly. But say I insinuate it. Say I say, oh yeah, he's probably a pedophile or a rapist. You imagine whatever kind of libelous insinuation you'd like. It's not hard to do, and you can say, as various pundits have said, including Rachel Maddow, including Alex Jones, I'm not a news reporter. I'm an entertainer. And to borrow another C.S. Lewis quote, this time from the Screwtape Letters, people can get away with all kinds of the most vicious insults and allegations and falsehoods if they are able to successfully pass it off as, oh, it was only a joke. And, which is hard because sometimes it is just a joke. Sometimes you're teaching your dog to do a Hitler salute because it's actually funny.
Sure, but things said in jest, such as a comedian, is one thing. I think we've had this discussion before where, a joke landing wrong, and of course it's kind of backed up by their profession. So a lot of people looked at Jon Stewart, and nobody thought that Jon Stewart was, minus Bill O'Reilly in one debate, and Tucker Carlson actually in a debate as well. Nobody thought that what Jon Stewart was doing was genuine political discourse. Okay? And although it was politically useful and politically poignant, he's a comedian.
Is that
why? Because he's starred in multiple movies as a comedian. He goes up on stage as a comedian.
But is that a judgment of his intent, or is that a judgment of his effects? That he is, because there is a large class, or was a very large class of people in America who watched Jon Stewart. They also watched Stephen Colbert. And consciously, they understand that what they're watching is entertainment. But at the back of their mind, they believe that they are actually learning about the world and learning what's going on in the world in the news. And there are many people who believe that because they watch Stephen Colbert, they are actually more informed than the average Fox News viewer or CNBC viewer.
So, and this is why when we look at something as, I hate to say complex because it doesn't sound all that complex. When we look at someone like the news, okay, and when I say the news, I'm going to say Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, okay, the large major news corporations that we look at, especially to be labeled as Fox News, okay, something with the word news in it, honestly, should be absolutely prohibited under the law. And the reason for it is because they don't provide news. Okay, if you are going to provide news, it must be news, not commentary. And political entertainment, such as John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Jon Stewart, I have no problem with them being labeled as such. But the problem is, and they're free to do so, but just because they say something politically poignant does not necessarily mean, like, his effectiveness is fantastic. But what his statements were on point. He never slandered anyone.
So your problem is with the word news, then. Is that right?
Yes, because it is the same reason that I have with the problem with the word Antifa, is because they use it specifically to identify as one thing while being something completely something else.
What does news mean to you?
Notable events, weather, and sports.
Notable events, weather, and sports.
That's the word news.
Do you think everybody has that same interpretive understanding of what news is and what constitutes news? Do you think some sports or weather, for example, might qualify as news to you but wouldn't qualify to someone else?
That's me being cheeky in general, because that's what
that's a good working definition.
Well, that's what the acronym means. That's literally what the word news is notable events, weather, and sports. But the problem is we have it as a collective interpretation of the ongoing events, notable, and something that we should be informed about that's affecting our world, right? It's informative, and I'd like to make sure that this is a staple of what we consider news. Factual. We consider the news factual, where we are like sports, cool. Like this, what are the scores? Wait, these people, won on here. They won against these people.
So
what's the weather like tomorrow? Factually, according to our data, this is what the weather's going to look like. And here's the notable events. Unfortunately, that's not what we have anymore. I don't, remember the last time that Fox News covered any kind of sporting event other than to tell LeBron James to shut up. 2, I don't ever see them covering weather unless it's a matter of Snowmageddon 2015. Oh my God, we're all going to die. Did you know how we're all going to die? Did you know we're dead? So this kind of over dramatized, ratings focused nonsense with the word news associated with it, when news is supposed to be factual, as much as possible.
Here's my problem with that take, and it's a good start. It sounds like we'd get out of our problem. But suppose in a hypothetical world, I had an axe to grind. And so I put together a news organization. I put together a media group that puts out news stories. And the stories I put out are entirely factual. But I choose the stories. I choose the stories that conform with my worldview. And I omit stories that don't. And I report them in a very monotonous, even toned, very professional voice. I don't really exaggerate things anytime I'm putting opinions out. I'm interviewing someone else, so it's not my opinion. I'm just, getting a variety of opinions that all happen to kind of coalesce around my own view. And maybe I call this program NPR. And I put this out, and voila, we have an objective, straightforward news source that's providing real news, except there's still a bias inherent to that can mislead people, that can let people draw their own conclusions in a way where I sort of guide them towards those conclusions. You don't really escape the subjectivity in creation. This is like the classical historian's dilemma in the philosophical sense. How do you determine which events in the past were relevant and notable and which ones are not worth including? Is it worth including that one time that Julius Caesar went to the toilet in Gaul? Nah, probably not. Probably not worth devoting 8 words to that. We'll leave that space for something more important. When
was the last time you actually learned about Hannibal?
Right. I have to delve into some dark parts of YouTube to find anything good on that. More results on the Lecter one than the real one. But so the subjectivity in language has as much to do with the selection. And again, none of that even gets around the problem of the subjective interpretation of the words themselves. And this is where I get more defensive even of people that I hate and consider to be an enemy. For example, Facebook and Twitter and the tech giants, on matters of hosting speech. Because when you understand the way in which language can be maliciously misinterpreted, your most important right where free speech is concerned isn't the First Amendment, it's the Fifth. It's the right to not self-incriminate. And this is something that most spiritual traditions have kind of come to. I know in the Havamal there's several lines actually about the value of keeping your mouth shut. A fool is better off, staying quiet and maybe being suspected of being a fool than opening it and proving it full on. I actually might be quoting something else, but the Bible has this. Most spiritual traditions understand the value of silence. And in contrast to that, we have this millennial and Gen Z ethos of the importance of speaking out, the importance of speaking truth to power on matters that you have no experience or understanding of. You think you understand something because you see the surface level. You think it's important to speak out about global warming because we don't want the world to burn. Never mind that all the models that you've been presented have been disproved, but they keep being presented. And never mind that the people funding this are, on both sides of the issue, are either oil companies on one side or green energy companies that are just as bad for the environment on the other. Neither one is good. And you have no understanding of the real conflict going on here. But by speaking out on it, you tie yourself to a side that you don't understand because you've spoken without making that mental connection in the first place.
I encourage anybody to watch the new Michael Moore film. I normally don't recommend Michael Moore, but his latest film was actually genuinely really good, and it's called Planet of the Humans. It's available for free on Amazon Videos or Prime Video. They talk about the Green Movement and how negative it is for the environment. So, but we are looking at people such as, let's use Tommy Robinson as an example.
You mean TR, the man who must not be named.
Oh yes,
we're not on YouTube,
must not be named,
so we can say Tommy.
So,
but yeah.
So TR. Well, also I could just call him Stephen Lennon, because that's his real name. So Stephen Lennon he was pretty much
Robbie Tomlinson.
Banned from pretty much everything in the United Kingdom. Okay, he's pretty much banned from everything. He's been thrown in jail dozens of times for speech violations, offense violations, and they don't have a protection of free speech in Britain. All right, we already know this. The one recommendation that I actually do have is one where I actually find that Tommy Robinson, to me, would not be a violation here in the United States, but I think it should be. But he did violate something in the UK, which was he reported on a story in order to sway public opinion. Huh?
An ongoing trial, wasn't it?
Yes, he tried to report on an ongoing trial to sway the opinion of the constituents in a negative favor towards those who were, up for justice. Like they were being sentenced, or they were being tried and potentially sentenced soon thereafter. They were actually found guilty, but the thing is, they still have the right to the fair trial. And he tried to betray that, which is a rule in the UK. You can't try to sway public opinion in an ongoing trial. They have a right to a fair trial that is done by an impartial jury. If you give a whole bunch of information that is swayed, you can make the jury non-impartial. So that's where I think that we need to be at. I think that the United States, regardless of our adherence to freedom of speech, there are certain rights that must be protected above others. Okay, we face this on a regular basis. Almost every single thing that ever goes to the Supreme Court, we have rights that face off against other rights. Is your right to freedom of religion violate my right to run a shop as I see fit?
So I have a question relating to the Tommy Robinson situation, though. Suppose you and I are just acquaintances, not friends. We've met at work somewhere, and I say something about you on the internet that is disparaging of your character in a kind of generic, he strikes me as an untrustworthy and maybe aggressive kind of guy, or something. And then later on in life, you get accused of something. Say you attacked, someone attacked a hobo on the street, and the guy happened to look a little bit like you. And now you're being accused of this, and you're being brought in front of some trial. It becomes a big thing. You're in some larger state Supreme Court. I don't know. In any case, you're on trial for the egregious crime of assaulting a hobo, and someone dredges up my blog post about you. Now, this all happened, my commentary on your character and your aggressive tendencies towards vagrants, that's going to color the opinion of people on the trial, potentially. Right? Or I imagine it very well could. But I'm not trying to actively change the outcome of the trial, but it has that effect. Right?
So if somebody drudged that up so that all depends on the manner in which it was drudged up. If this was done by some random citizen or a news corporation who is covering the fact that I was on trial, and they go, look, this guy is a shady character years back on this guy's blog post. This is one thing that I advocate against. Like, yeah, you shouldn't be able to report on ongoing trials because it violates your Sixth Amendment of a fair and speedy trial and an impartial jury of your peers. That's Sixth and Seventh. But if it was the judge, or if it was like, let's say, the prosecution who brought that up, if they brought it up as a surprise exhibit, that would be thrown out for a mistrial. And two, if it was if they brought it up, say, hey, we'd like to enter this into an exhibit,
it would be thrown
that's
out for
complete and utter hearsay.
That would be thrown out for a mistrial. But that's
if they brought it up as a surprise exhibit because it's introducing hearsay.
introducing hearsay. Well, then, don't we live in a justice system that is almost entirely governed by hearsay?
Would not. If that was brought up by the prosecution, it would not be submitted as evidence.
Don't think of my example as a literal hypothetical anymore. Think of it as a metaphor for the linguistic world that we live in at large, where everyone is constantly talking about.
I do. And that's the biggest problem that I face with a lot of people when discussing law, is that when you're facing a trial, there's certain areas, like, it all depends on who says it. If the news says it because it was brought up and it sways the opinion of the jury, no harm, no foul. Oh well. Mm-hmm. It's a national story of, a young Patrick Stewart who has just a touch of Downs decides to beat up some hobos, because I don't think I look like a hobo. I think that's how I look. It's a young Patrick Stewart. But if the news does it, and it sways the opinion of the jury so much so that we can't verify whether or not that news story swayed them into saying I was guilty, no harm, no foul, even though my rights were absolutely abused and I was subjected to harm for something I didn't do if it was turned out that I was innocent. Comparatively, that in a trial, if a prosecutor, which is an administrator of the state or an enforcer of the state, introduces that as evidence, the court would be required to throw it out as hearsay. It has no evidentiary purpose to the trial. And this is where, even if you were to take this not as face value, this is the thing that happened, but in any context, hey, what if this kind of thing happens? There is a different form of government and a system for the court versus swaying the opinion of the jury because somebody like Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow has enough reach and the jurors all watch that person. Right. So, and we saw that with not the Covington kids, but who's the Duke lacrosse team in the rape trial?
That was the worst. Yeah.
So there was multiple jury members who thought they were guilty based on what they saw on the news, not what was presented on evidence. Right. That's been talked about multiple times by people who were there. So if the news has that much power, should we, with the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, as well as the free press, allow them to do that when it can potentially violate the rights of the Sixth and Seventh Amendment?
Well, and I think this is what finally brought me to my position, which is that the defense of free speech becomes such a tortured and convoluted argument that you're almost better off saying, you know what, maybe what we're trying to defend isn't free speech. Maybe it's something more like free inquiry. We want to defend people's right to travel as they see, but we're not permitting every single action, right? There are laws against certain actions. They say your right to swing your fist ends at my nose. And where speech is concerned, maybe it's just easier to say, maybe freedom of speech isn't what we really want to defend. There was a justice, I forget which one it was. It might have been Clarence Thomas, but it might have been someone else. I believe it was the Bong Hits for Jesus case, where he, in the context of freedom of speech at schools, was complaining that it seems that the Supreme Court's position on free speech seems to be students have freedom of speech except when they don't. And he said, maybe for clarity, we're better off just biting the bullet and saying maybe they don't, which would incidentally be in line with the original First Amendment in 1789, which was a prohibition on prior restraint. They couldn't stop you from saying something, but they could punish you for it.
So this is where we keep running into a lack of knowledge on the fundamentals of the Constitution and what our founding fathers wanted. Okay, and I like going into figuratives or examples, basically. I forgot the word. It's on the tip of my tongue. Sorry. Hypotheticals. There we go. Words are hard for me. But I've got a buddy of mine who's a history teacher. Mm. And he and I debate politics on a regular basis. He's significantly more conservative than I am. He's actually a history teacher in California, no less.
Brave man.
He does not enjoy it. But when he and I debate politics, he and I really go hard into history. And with his and my collective understanding of history, it tends to be really, really enjoyable. And the biggest one that I keep running into is people's lack of understanding of what the founding fathers wanted. And they go, well, the founding fathers would have wanted this. And I simply go, oh, well, here, let me look at the Federalist Papers, shall we?
Well, like which founding fathers, right? Because there were also the Anti-Federalist Papers.
So, the Federalist Papers won out because we have a constitution, so checkmate. So I look at this one, okay? So to look at the idea of what freedom of speech is and who should be actually the one to check and balance this, go look at Federalist 10. Like James Madison, it was a very explicit that what did he call it? It's the violence of faction, I believe is what he called it. Basically, he wanted to design a government that was... He knew that humanity was selfish and that we would want to utilize the power of the state for our own means to drive our own political goals. Okay? And they would more than likely utilize the opportunity for freedom of speech to leverage that opportunity with the enforcement of the state, which is why he wrote Federalist 51, I believe it is. And it's talking about checks and balances. What can the government do and what can't it do? And the problem that we face is that we're in unprecedented territory. We don't know where we're at. Is that it's never been an idea that a singular broadcasting organization can slander one person to such a degree it can violate the rights of others so quickly that more than likely they didn't know the internet was going to come about. They didn't think that anybody could just speak and it's there. Okay, they had to send letters. Okay, on the other hand, so if you were to write a story about something, one, it was old news, and by the time your opinion got to other people, especially broadly, this is months old. The court trial is already over, and you're already done. So they can't really influence the judicial proceedings. On the other hand, now you can be in the middle of your trial, and the jurors can be swayed because they don't watch the news. Yes, I'm sure nobody watches the news, but the Duke lacrosse team, the Covington Catholic kid, and multitudes of other people have just had their rights absolutely destroyed and ripped from them simply because people want a few extra clicks on their website.
Right.
And this is where the Supreme Court must start to come in is this a right of the media to be able to have that much power to violate other people's rights? Even though they're free to say it, sure. But maybe they should be free to say it after the conclusion of the trial.
Well, what defines a media organization?
Is
it based on influence? Because then if a single individual grew just large enough, would they not be a media organization whose right to free speech could be mitigated on the basis of that definition?
Well, this is where TR came into it, Tommy Robinson. Mm-hmm. He's a single guy. He was a single guy broadcasting to a few of his fans. Regardless of his reach, he was just a guy blogging.
Right.
And he was still in violation of the law.
And he
had an effect. But it's a violation of the law. Yeah, we're still in the middle of trial. No, the judge has put a gag order. Let them go through their rights. Let them go through their process. If you don't like it, you can say afterwards, hey, this is a screwed up judicial proceeding and we don't trust it. Sure, that's absolutely your prerogative. On the other hand, you are potentially destroying the rights of other people to be able to have a fair and impartial trial, which is probably the biggest thing that a system has, is trust of their legal system to punish people for what they did wrong and find the innocent, and to go through that process and have the inevitable outcome done by the system of an impartial third-party arbiter.
Well, but trust in the legal system, the legal system itself is composed of words and traditions of interpretation, and just as with speech in general, the meanings of these words and laws, the meaning of these laws has changed with time. And so the case that always speaks to me on this is Abrams versus the United States. It was in, I want to say, 1919. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who basically had said previously that it was a man's sacred right to punish and persecute and even commit violence against a man whose opinion he disagrees with, completely changed his mind after spending time with some radical socialists in his circle, and said basically, it seems perfectly logical to me to persecute people for expressing opinions, but it's important to allow that opposition because, and then he gives basically the classic Milton and John Stuart Mill arguments for free speech, the competition of the market, free market of ideas, and so forth. And he says that was the original idea, the original theory of our Constitution, when he knows or knew previously, everyone suffers from this Alzheimer's occasionally, that it actually wasn't. And we know that it wasn't because mere months, if not a few years after the passing of the Constitution, we passed some of our earliest Alien and Sedition Acts, which prohibited speech that insulted the American government or the uniform of the armed forces. And that was months after the passage of the First Amendment. Can we deduce what the intent was from that? Because when I hear Christopher Hitchens talk about hate speech, and he mentions the First Amendment, where he says that's what bans prior restraint in the United States, he's not talking about the more absolutist position, though he himself takes that position. And I think the real spirit of the law that the founders were trying to encapsulate is actually better articulated by a later judge. One of my favorite justices is actually Robert Jackson, in his ruling on, I think it's Barnett, where he says, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no government official can tell you what is orthodox in matters of opinion. They can't make you say this. But that's not the same as the absolute right to speech. That's much closer to the Fifth Amendment than it is to the First. And I think by juxtaposing the massive shift that we see in Justice Holmes versus the what I think is a more consistent view of Justice Robert Jackson, we get a closer view of what the only kind of non-contradictory concept of free speech that's defensible. Because otherwise we run into these issues of, well, who's allowed to say this, and what if they influence an ongoing trial, which they inevitably will, and what about libel? What is and isn't libel? Can comedy be libel? Words work by association. If I say Joe Biden is not a rapist, Joe Biden is only a sniffer. Joe Biden is not a rapist. Joe Biden is only a sniffer. And I repeat that, and I make that into a meme, and it gets thousands upon thousands upon thousands of reshares and retweets everywhere. That's going to have an effect on his reputation.
Well, I think we're arguing the wrong thing. And let me pivot this kind of conversation just slightly, because I think it's necessary to bring up a recent event. Okay, so Gina Carano, right? I'm sure you heard about it. For anybody who hasn't, she put out an Instagram post basically talking about political persecution. Okay, and she was fired by Disney. And the reason I bring this up is because criticizing a public figure, let's say that an actor, okay, she is not an elected representative. She does not have the power of the state at her disposal. Would you agree?
Right.
Cool. And yet Joe Biden does. He has an intrinsic power that Gina Carano does not. So it's fair that as he is a voluntary elected representative of ours. Okay.
So does that mean that Facebook should have these protections? Because they're not a government institution.
Well, let me finish this point. Is that with Gina Carano, I'll read the post just simply so you know what she said. It was, Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children. quote, because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews. How is it that how's that any different from hating someone for their political views? And because of that tweet, Disney fired her. Now, when she put that out there, and Disney fired her.
Breaking news: Disney supports beating up Jews. That's my interpretation of that, and no one can persuade me otherwise.
So that is, I completely think, is justified. Why? Because she put it out, the company saw it, and they wanted to distance themselves from her. Fair enough. That is the freedom of association that I completely approve of. I personally think that I don't think she did anything wrong, but I don't run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. In which case, I have to say that this is one form of censorship because it was done freely by the association who was in contract with her. On the other hand, where I start to see a violation of Twitter, Facebook, and others is instead of allowing the focus on Facebook or Twitter, why not broaden the aspect of tortious interference? Is that if you go on a crusade to destroy someone, their reputation or their business or whatever, and it gets them fired, it gets their business lost, it hurts somebody, it causes tangible, financial, or reputational, in some form of tangible harm. That's tortious interference. You are interfering with a contract between two entities who are mutually beneficial to each other in a financial contract. That is tortious interference. Why are we not prosecuting the people who go after them instead of focusing on the corporations who are literally just trying to make a buck and not wanting bad reputations associated with it? So instead of destroying the entire foundation of the United States of saying the First Amendment, free speech, blah, 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 no. You tried to destroy someone who bases their entire monetary income on reputation. And you violated, and you did this in an attempt to get them fired. Yes, that's tortious interference.
Well, I don't disagree. That does sound like a. I think tortious interference is a very useful doctrine for going after a lot of people who didn't believe in free speech, but have just now discovered how useful claiming freedom of speech can be when the shoe is on the other foot. Many censors have started now claiming free speech protection from when they tortiously interfere with others. But, and this is the whole paradox all over again, what's the difference between serious investigative journalism, the sort that exposes corruption either in a corporate institution or in government, and tortious interference, or if it's in government of subversion of the United States? Because I'm sure China could do a lot of honest, true investigative reporting of American government and seriously undermine it that way. And
sure,
I'm saying the line is blurry, and if tortious interference could be true even if the allegations are also true. A true statement could also tortiously interfere if it affects someone's reputation in a negative way.
Sure, but investigative journalism is based on two things. Is one, and it's different than reporting about something that's going on, regarding what Tommy Robinson did. Because investigative journalism is normally done to bring awareness for potential investigation into an issue, such as Enron, such as government corruption, insert here. And more often than not, following a story like that, there is a lot of times government investigation into the corruption that was brought up. On the other hand, what Tommy Robinson did, hey, this is going on. The government has already investigated it. They're currently in the middle of the system going through the process to see whether or not this person is guilty of doing what is reported that they did. So if you are doing investigative journalism to bring awareness to a situation that is going unheard, more power to you. On the other hand, if the government and the system already has it in their hands it's going through trial. Those are two completely different issues.
I mean, they might be, but they also might not, because this is the historians or the news reporters bias by way of selection of the story. And I mean, if point me to a person and I can find something that would damage their reputation in their life if it were made public knowledge, myself included. Literally everyone has things.
But that's a personal issue versus if you're going after a person versus a company or a government entity. I would say that those are kind of leaps and bounds apart. If you have a vendetta to go against somebody and you're just going to smear their reputation, I would say, you should be liable for tortious interference if what you said turns out to be a lie.
Right. Right.
If it's true, like you can't really do much about it.
I guess my greater point here is that there's the subjectivity inherent in language makes a defense of free speech in a world where we try to draw lines and say, well, okay, this is not protected speech. This form of libel is not protected speech. This kind of incitement to violence is not protected speech. I think my favorite instance making fun of this is the whitest kids did a video on how it's illegal to say, I want to kill the president of the United States. Totally illegal. Don't say that. But what's funny is it's really, really illegal to say, I think the best way to do it would be a mortar launcher from the Lincoln building because it has direct line of sight and very little security. Totally illegal, insanely illegal to say. Of course, it's okay for me to say this because
I'm telling you what not to do.
Explaining to you what not to do. And I am definitely not saying that I think someone should go and kill the president of the United States of America. As he stares
with a mortar launcher from the Lincoln building,
meaningfully into the camera, in this dead serious. It's like that kind of subjectivity is almost not something that you can legislate on, meaningfully. And this is the tough bind we're in. When I first presented this, you said, well, the lowest common denominator is kind of always a problem. But I think it's deeper than that. And there's this great David Foster Wallace quote in his essay E Unibus Plurum about the effect of television on America, where he says that television is a low form of art. It's a kind of a lowbrow, low intellect thing. But he says that's not really because people are stupid. People in general are actually very smart, but they're very smart about specific things. And the things that they are in agreement on tend to be stupid. The lowest common denominator, I guess it is a lowest common denominator, but even smart people are dumb about a lot of things. And if you are trying to appeal to a wider audience, you have to speak in a lower fashion. And it keeps going down. Actually, I can pull up the quote directly here.
So while you pull that up, but that's normally the reason the judiciary gets involved, is that a lot of this is supposed to be in the spirit of the law. What was the law intended to do? And is this a faithful interpretation of this law in practice? Like, nobody wants sexual predators to go free for no reason, but we also don't want somebody who is suddenly really someone who has a prostate issue taking a piss on a tree as hidden as possible to be put onto the sexual offenders watch list for flashing. So what's the spirit of the law? To protect people. What was he doing? Was he trying to do this? No, then that's a breaking of the spirit of the law.
Right. Well, and I think that the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts mere months after the passage of the Bill of Rights maybe says more about the original spirit of the First Amendment than our modern, more absolutely inclined understanding of it, separated by 250 years or so. But I found the quote. He says, David Foster Wallace says, "It's undeniable that television is an example of low art, the sort of art that tries too hard to please. Because of the economics of nationally broadcast, advertiser-subsidized entertainment, television's one goal, never denied by anyone in or around TV since RCA first authorized field tests in 1936, is to ensure as much watching as possible. TV is the epitome of low art in its desire to appeal to and enjoy the attention of unprecedented numbers of people. But TV is not low because it is vulgar or prurient or stupid. It is often all these things, but it is a logical function of its need to please audience. And I'm not saying that television is vulgar and dumb because the people who compose audience are vulgar and dumb. Television is the way it is simply because people tend to be really similar in their vulgar and prurient and stupid interests, and wildly different in their refined and moral and intelligent interests. It's all about syncretic diversity. Neither medium nor viewers are responsible for quality. And that's that part of the quote. So, I don't know if I changed anyone's minds on it, but I hope it's at least a criticism of free speech most people haven't heard before, and again, the ironic part of this criticism of free speech is it's just as hard on censorship. It requires us to, the responsibility for censorship has to fall on ourselves. We have to self-censor, and that's why the Fifth Amendment, as Robert Jackson so eloquently put it, is perhaps more valuable than the First.
Also, don't talk to the police.
Yeah. You have the right to remain silent because everything can and will be used against you in a court of law or outside a court of law in public opinion on salon.com or wherever else.
They never say that anything you say will be used to help you in court. No. This is going to be used against you. Don't say anything. Don't talk to them.
They're after scalps. Get them some Nazi scalps, even if you're not a Nazi. So.
Yeah. And although I will have to retouch sooner or later on when does a private entity become a government entity with such revolving doors of.
Yeah, that's a real deep question.
So I will leave you with that one for a little while because I have a really good feeling I'm not going to get a good answer right now.
No, that's going to take some research. We'll have to talk to some people because that's a really good potential one. But yeah, it does look like we're going on for close to 2 hours now. Might have to do some editing at some point later. We'll see. We want to call it a night? I think it's been a good conversation.
Sure. It's 10:30 over where I'm at, and we can end the very first podcast of Caffeine Philosophy.
First Caffeine Philosophy stream.
Starring Christopher Robertson and Kyle Broussard.
Yeah, Chris and Kyle. That sounds like South Park characters.
Hey, I'm getting the new name soon. Yeah, it's planned, and I have the full name. Did I tell you my full new name?
It's the pirate one, right?